Hello everyone and welcome to the online classes that we're having in lieu of a couple of class periods here right around fall break. Before we get started, I'd like to just deal with one item of business. You probably note that you can see pretty much the entire slide and the items on the slide won't be revealing themselves kind of one step at a time like I tend to do in class. And I am concerned that what's going to happen is you're going to just write everything down on the slide and miss what I say in the first few bullet points. So I'd like to ask you to do one of two things. One is to either stop the audio at the beginning of each slide and write down everything that's on the slide, leaving space for extra stuff that I might be adding. Or two, to really control yourself and make sure you only write down the point that I'm talking about, rather than trying to get down everything on the slide while the audio is going. I'm just afraid that you'll miss information. Of course, you can always go back and listen to it again. It's the great thing about having a recording. Anyway, so enough about business. We are going to be dealing with 2 or 3 topics, depending on how you look at it, in this online lecture. We're going to start with a discussion of explanatory style, as you see here. And then we're going to move on to the work of Julian Rotor, and there's 2 topics we're going to deal with as we discuss his work, and I'll introduce those to you once we get to the section on him. So first, explanatory style. As we look at the concept of explanatory style, we are relying heavily on the work of Martin Seligman, whose name you might recognize. If you hang around in psychology long enough, you certainly will encounter him from time to time. But he's not the only one who's worked on this stuff. Others have as well. And in fact, the work that we're talking about today is really one root of a very powerful and popular new area within psychology called positive psychology. And we'll be talking about that a couple of chapters down the line. But Seligman's work that we talk about today actually in some ways predates that model of positive psychology. Explanatory style is very simply how a person typically interprets situations, right? I mean, they get a good grade on a test. How do they interpret that? They get turned down for a job after what they thought was a great interview. How do they interpret that? And in many ways, in fact, pretty much entirely, the field of explanatory style overlaps with the idea of attributions or attribution theory. Now, if you don't know what attribution theory is, don't worry about it. But if you've taken social psychology or, in human diversity, we talk about it a little bit. You may have encountered it before, and so if explanatory style already sounds familiar, that's perhaps why. Martin Seligman, his own particular take, or kind of versions, I guess you might say, of explanatory style. And really, it started with his work on learned helplessness, and this is the work of his that you might be familiar with. Seligman, actually quite some time ago, I want to say sometime maybe in the 70s, did a very classic series of experiments, kind of a sad series of experiments because it involves giving dogs shocks, not shocks that hurt them, but shocks that are uncomfortable. And you may have heard about this research where he would take 2 dogs and each would be in its own kind of cage, and that the floor of the cage would be electrified a little bit, just to make the dogs a bit uncomfortable. And one of the dogs, if they searched around enough, could figure out how to get out of the situation. In other words, how to turn off the electrified floor, whereas the other dog could not. Okay, there was no way in the cage the second dog was in that the floor could be manipulated by the dog. And after some time in these 2 types of cages, both dogs were moved to other cages where both floors were electrified, and both cages had a way that the dog could escape from the electric shock. And what Seligman found is that dogs who initially basically learned, if you will, that their behavior was irrelevant, that there was nothing they could do to get out of the situation with the shock, even when they were put in a context where they could, never learned how to escape the shock. And he called this learned helplessness. And ultimately this idea was transferred to work with people as well. How if a child, for example, in school gets the message that there's nothing you can do to improve your grades, you're just dumb, really there's no sense in trying, and so the child basically gives up. and displays what we call learned helplessness. Fortunately, Seligman didn't leave it on that pessimistic note. He also turned this concept around and started talking about learned optimism. In other words, how is it that we can develop, how is it that we do develop, and how is it that we can deliberately develop the tendency to interpret situations in ways that are optimistic, in ways that emphasize our ability to affect situations. And what I'd like to invite you to do is, you see there's a little tag there on the YouTube video that invites you to visit a website. I'd like you to go to that website to learn a little bit more about these characteristics. And there's many different sections on this site, as you'll see. The first section, I believe it's the first, is called Explanatory Style. I'm sorry, it's the second section. It's called Explanatory Style. And the third, I believe, Explaining Positive and Negative Events. And I'd like you to just take a look at those. They will flesh out the idea of explanatory style and what the difference is between somebody who is optimistic and conversely somebody who is pessimistic, which learned helplessness kind of conveys that idea of pessimism. There's really no hope for making the situation better. And you'll notice that Seligman's work really emphasizes the cognitive aspects, the way that optimists and pessimists interpret situations. Whereas, if something good happens, an optimist tends to, take credit for it, if you will, and see it as something that's going to continue, whereas the pessimist tends to think it's, kind of luck, if you will, and it expects it to go away very soon. So you'll see there's different ways of conceptualizing both positive and negative situations. So I would like you to take a look at that section called Explaining Positive and Negative Events, and I would like you to know that information in that section. If you scroll down, there's several videos there. You can watch them if you want, you don't have to, but they do illustrate kind of this optimistic interpretation of events that Seligman talks about. If you continue to scroll down, you get to a section called Philosophers' Notes on Learned Optimism. And there, a video blogger reviews Martin Seligman's book, Learned Optimism. And if you would like to just kind of hear another description of the concept of explanatory style, of Seligman's original research on learned helplessness, etc., I would suggest you watch that video. Again, the video in the section called Philosopher's Notes, right, on learned optimism. Just to, again, kind of hear from a different perspective what these concepts are all about. So Seligman has made a major contribution. I mean, certainly optimism and pessimism are two personality concepts that are, not only big in psychology, but we talk about them in our daily life as well. And not only has his work been helpful in helping us understand how people develop into optimists or pessimists based on their history of being able to affect events or not, but as you'll see, if you decide to spend a lot of time on the site that I'm referring to, Seligman has also developed programs in order to train optimism. So kind of therapeutic interventions to help people become more optimistic, and you might enjoy taking a look at those as well. All right, so please do visit the website. Take a look at the sections called Explanatory Style, Explaining Positive and Negative Events, and if you have an extra 10 minutes, watch the video in the section on the Philosopher's Notes on Learned Optimism. Let's move on after you're done with that. All right, now we're going to move on to the person on whom we will be concentrating for the remainder of this PowerPoint, and that is Julian Rotor. Julian Rotor lived, basically almost 100 years, it seems. I think he was in his 90s when he died, and that was not long ago. So from the early 1900s to like 2014, I think it was, when he died. He is one of the first people, along with Bandura, to really explore things from what we might call a social cognitive perspective. He puts forth some concepts that I think you will see are very influenced by learning theories or behavioral theories, but there's definitely a cognitive element to them. We're going to cover a couple of his concepts, or a couple of his foci, right, focuses in his research. The first, Locus of Control, is a concept that he is very well known for, probably one of the most fruitful concepts in terms of research in psychology. And then just to give you kind of another taste of some of the stuff that he's done, I want to turn to another concept that he looked at that not many psychologists do look at, and that actually some people don't even know that Rotor himself looked at, and that's the issue of trust, how trusting is a person. All right, so we're going to go into some detail on locus of control. We'll talk a little bit about trust as well. Let's move on. All right, so let's take a look at this very well-known concept of Rotor's, the locus of control. Basically, and you'll see that this shares some conceptual similarity with attribution theory and expectancy as well. Locus of control is a person's answer to the following question. Are the reinforcements I get related to my own behaviors and or personal characteristics, or are they not? Okay, so basically it's what kind does a person expect that they are going to have, some control over receiving reinforcements. And Rotor talks about actually a continua of locus of control that ranges from internal to external. Here on the slide I say two types, probably better said it's like two ends of the continuum. Somebody who is leaning towards having an internal locus of control believes that reinforcements are contingent upon their own behavior or upon something about them. So they have a sense of control over receiving reinforcements. External locus of control is, as you might guess, just opposite. A person who leans towards an external locus of control believes that reinforcements are not related to anything about them, their own behavior, their characteristics. Something outside of them, external to them, is delivering, shall we say, the reinforcements. So if we took a situation such as playing in a football game, somebody who has an internal locus control believes really that they can make a difference in the outcome of the game. Okay, that the reinforcement winning, or at least having a great play or something like that, is contingent upon what they do as the player. Whereas somebody who has a more external locus of control, would believe that something like luck or the intelligence of the play that the coach has called, or how bad the other team is, or something like that, is really what is in charge of the reinforcements. And I think you can probably sense that just like with issues related to learned helplessness, there are potential emotional outcomes of having one or the other locus of control in certain environments. We're going to talk a little bit about the research on locus of control, but if you are interested, before we move on to that slide, I've got a couple of links here that you are welcome to take a look at. It's not required, okay? These are just kind of for your enjoyment, if you will. The first of these, as you see, is a locus of control test. So it's a fairly straightforward, simple little test that assesses whether you lean towards an internal or an external locus of control. And you get a score and all that good stuff. And if you wish, this is a test that you could write about in your personality paper. You might want to, if you do decide to take it and think you might want to include it in your paper, you might want to just, copy the test with your score and put it in a Word file or something like that for future reference. There's also a BBC interview with Rotor a couple of years before he died. So feel free to check that out. He talks about locus of control in some detail in that interview, and it might be enjoyable and educational in terms of fleshing out these concepts. All right, on this, I'm just giving you a taste of some of the research out there on locus of control. It is a very well-researched concept, many, many papers out there. We could probably spend a week delving into all of the research on this topic. But instead, I'm trying to, in the first bullet point here, kind of distill much of the research into one sentence, which is, of course, oversimplifying things. But then also to throw a little bit of a kind of a cultural wrench, if you will, into things. I also want to talk a little bit about the relationship between power or resources that a person has access to and their locus of control. So let's just deal with the first bullet point here, that I guess it's technically the second, the first red one, that the finding that in many studies we find that having an internal locus of control, or tending towards a more internal locus of control, is generally linked to better psychological outcomes. So take your pick: depression, lower anxiety, stronger self-esteem, all that good stuff. And in some ways, perhaps that makes sense, right? I mean, if we have a sense of control over our life, and that learned helplessness research seems to kind of suggest this too, in general, we're happier people. That being said, I will add that much of this research, like most research that we look at, has been done in Western cultures. And of course, we really value being in control of our lives and having choice and freedom, and, focusing on kind of who we are as people, and, puffing ourselves up in terms of, liking the characteristics that we have, and things like that. So I wonder if there would necessarily be this relationship between internal locus of control and psychological health in cultures that are not as individualistic and proactive as ours. And by proactive, I mean we again like to think that we have control, and we plan, and we try to head off problems due to our own great decision making. Not all cultures are that way. Okay. The second point I think is interesting because it points to a possibility. It's only correlational, but it points to a possibility of some of the things that might actually socialize people towards having one or another loci. Not sure what the plural would be of that. One or another locus of control. And this is the research that looks at the relationship between power, so access to resources, things like socioeconomic status. Rotor was doing a lot of his work, around the time before and right after the Civil Rights, so belonging to ethnic groups that may have less power in society. Perhaps not surprisingly, some of the research suggests that those who belong to certain groups of people with less power tend to have higher scores on external locus of control. They tend to lean towards external locus of control. And in some ways that makes sense. And I'm going to propose a causal relationship, realizing that the data doesn't necessarily demonstrate cause and effect. But if you don't have a lot of resources, right, and if you've been socialized your whole life to think that you are less than, or have been given messages that you don't have, characteristics that our society values, such as, intelligence or academic achievement or what have you, I think it would be quite easy to come to the conviction that really there are other factors outside of you that have determined who you have become, and determined, in Rotor's language, determine the reinforcements you get. So it's just worth thinking about, and it shows, I think, the possible connection between social and cultural factors and the development of locus of control. All right, so again, very rich research. I hope you can see, where Rotor, in this case, has drawn from behavioral theories with his emphasis on a person's concern about where their reinforcements come from. But I also hope you can see the cognitive emphasis in terms of locus of control being basically an expectancy, right? Am I going to have an impact on the kind of reinforcements I get or not? And also his focus on, what are the emotional and behavioral and cognitive outcomes of one locus of control or another. All right, moving on to a second major concept of Rotor's, one that he researched but hardly ever gets any press, like in textbooks and stuff, is the issue of interpersonal trust. But I think it's kind of interesting. And Rotor, in addition to developing a locus of control scale, also developed an interpersonal trust scale. And actually, if you would like to take that scale, I would encourage you to do that before we go through the rest of the material, so that I don't, bias your answers by educating you about it. In addition, especially, after you take it, if you feel like it's something you might want to include in your personality paper, I would, copy and paste all the information you get about your results and things like that. Okay? So follow the link there if you'd like to take that scale. You can stop this video and come back to it when you're done. All right, so how does Rotor describe or define interpersonal trust? He's pretty specific about it, as we might expect somebody with a behavioral background to be. He doesn't just have a behavioral background, but that's part of his background. And his definition, you see there in the second sub-bullet. Interpersonal trust, from his perspective, is a general expectancy that other people's communication, like a promise or if they say they'll do something, is reliable, that they will generally follow through. And if we were in class, we would spend some time talking about how this might be different from being gullibility. Rotor spent a lot of ink trying to distinguish the two. And he made the case that actually interpersonal trust, as he's defined it, in general is a positive thing, and we're going to see he has some evidence for that. Whereas gullibility is really a violation of social norm. As you see there, he defines gullibility as believing something when most people of the same social group would consider that belief, that expectancy, to be naive and foolish. So, for example, one might have a high level of interpersonal trust and in general, realize that, most people when they say they'll do something follow through. And yet, let's say there's somebody that's a part of your social circle that's kind of an inveterate liar, and nobody in your social group puts any, weight behind anything this person says. Well, if that person promises you, something, if you were to believe them and trust them, in that case, probably Rotor would say that's gullibility rather than interpersonal trust. Okay, so he distinguishes the two, and you probably noticed if you took a look at the interpersonal trust scale that they were very general questions. I mean, about, large groups of people. Politicians in general, or, people in general, parents in general, rather than, really specific or specific examples or things that would seem outlandish in the context of our society. Let's move on and see what some of the research says about those who display high interpersonal trust. It might be tempting to think that they are at a disadvantage, that people might be taking advantage of them, but actually, as we'll see, Rotor's research suggests otherwise. Let's move on. All right, here we'll just spend a couple of minutes unpacking some of the research on interpersonal trust. And as I just said, it's kind of tempting to think, well, if you're, super trusting, then, people are going to take advantage of you, you're going to be miserable. And I think in some ways Rotor is trying to rescue the word trust, because that super trusting attitude, that, may I even say stupidly trusting attitude, is what Rotor refers to as gullibility, like, having some level of trust when basically everyone around you, as well as social norms, tell you you should not, okay? So this more balanced, generalized form of interpersonal trust, much research, whether it's Rotor or those who came after him, others who picked up on his work, has shown that trust scale scores tend to be positively related to trustworthy behavior. So those who have a more kind of general trust that people are reliable act in a more reliable way themselves, which I suppose makes some sense. If for no other reason than they're trying to live up to perceived social pressure, right? If others are reliable, I better be reliable too. The research suggests they also have, in general, better psychological adjustments. So, they're happier people, better self-esteem, less pathology like depression and anxiety. Okay, so better adjusted. So not at all are these people like, feeling awful about life because people are consistently taking advantage of them. One of the concepts you encounter in this chapter is social and emotional intelligence, and this third item really kind of taps into that. There's a positive relationship between interpersonal trust and decoding nonverbal communication. In other words, being able to read somebody's nonverbals, which is a sign of social intelligence, a sign that you've got, interpersonal skill, if you will. Again, showing that interpersonal trust, as Rotor's define it, actually tends to go along with more capacity for interpersonal relationships rather than less. And then finally, and you maybe would expect that Rotor would have explored this, he also shows, his work shows a higher relationship between trust and internal locus of control, which again, at least in our Western culture, tends to be linked with positive psychological characteristics. All right, so this is kind of a handful of pieces of evidence that suggest that trust, at least as Rotor's defined it, actually is something that is positive rather than negative. As we move on, I'm going to introduce you to a possible extra credit assignment. So when you get to the next slide, you'll hear a little bit more about that. Okay, on this last slide, I just want to introduce you to the first of several extra credit options that I will give you. And so let's just kind of read this through together. In my classes, I offer students a choice of ways to earn 5 points of extra credit. One choice will be posting to the discussion forum in my absence. And just as an aside, I think I showed you in class where that discussion forum is. It should be right under this lecture in Joule, okay? Picking up again on the slide here. If you don't wish to do this, there will be other choices later. You may only pick one option throughout the semester, okay? So I will give like a menu of extra credit things to choose from. You pick one, okay? So this is the first one I'm offering you. So if you decide to do this extra credit forum post, here's what you need to do. Please pick one of the following to write a 1 double-spaced page on, and then post what you wrote to the forum on Joule. So here are the 3 ones, and you just choose one, okay? What kind of locus of control should a Christian have? Be sure to define all your terms and defend your answer, okay? The second option, in what ways, other than what was mentioned in the lecture, might our Western culture lead to the finding that internal locus of control is beneficial? Okay, and then the last option, in what ways is trust a Christian virtue? In what ways is it not? Consider John 2:24 in your answer. Okay, and by Christian virtue I mean, a habit of life that, represents God and that we strive to embody. Okay, so like an aspect of holiness, if you will. Okay, so if you wish to do this extra credit option, pick one of those, write a double-spaced 1-page reflection as an answer, and then post that. You can just cut and paste into Joule. And if you don't wish to do this, I still would encourage you to read what your colleagues write. I'm sure some students will decide to post on this, and I will probably bring some of your ideas back to class and we'll talk a little bit about them. In addition, please feel free to use the discussion forum to post any questions that you might have as you guys prepare for your upcoming test. All right, take care.